Honorable Milemba, good morning. You've heard what parents in Taita Taveta County have said. Some are saying shule zifungwe, wengine wanasema shule zisifungwe, walimu wachukue jukumu la kuchunga watoto havai barakoa. What would you like to say about the sentiments that parents have actually said in that interview with my colleague Hezron Kimari?
Thank you, and thank you for this chance to be on your show and KTN. Now, the parents' sentiments are generally good and ordinary, and they are genuine. You know, that is the real person on the ground speaking. That is the real mindset of the person on the ground. And as you have seen, some of them are saying close the schools. The first parent who spoke was very sentimental because he thinks if the curve will go up like it's predicted by the Minister of Health, then it's better that every person stays with his children. Every man for himself and God for us all. That's the philosophy he seems to pick, despite the fact he was unable to answer when he was asked why it was difficult for them to take care of their children during the first phase of the pandemic when they were at home. And most of them, like the girls, got pregnant. Some of them fell out of school, like we have seen with the results that have come out. Second parents who spoke were cautious. They were saying we must balance between children being out of school, age that is continuously growing up, and the education that they'll be missing. So he was very cautious. He spoke with a second voice of cautiousness. And I think putting their minds together, the third parent talked about the teachers providing everything. And I think the teachers, when she talked about the teachers, she was referring to the government. The teachers must provide the temperature check issues and the masks and everything. I think her reference to teachers was a reference to the government of Kenya.
All right.
And I think the government has done nothing to do what that third parent was talking about.
All right. So based on what the parents in Taita Taveta County have said, from your perspective as the teacher's representative, as much as you're the member of parliament for Muhai, you're also a member of the National Assembly Education Committee. Do you think schools should remain closed in case the country reports that, goes to the fourth wave in July as projected by the Ministry of Health?
Thank you. Now, that's a more direct question. We have a committee that is dealing with COVID and education-related issues. And we are represented as CUPE together with the other stakeholders and the Ministry of Education. And that committee, again, we shall be sitting down to study and see how the situation will be. The first wave of COVID, we were completely unsure of what will happen and what is likely to happen, and our predictions were very wild, and therefore we took a very long time before we opened the schools. When we did open the schools, we thought it was a bad disaster, but we were able to survive. I must thank God for that and the Ministry of Health for everything else they did, that we were able to finish the first term with the candidates who were, I think, class 4 and class 8 and Form 4s. And when we brought the entire population of the children in school, again, we were very worried. In fact, me as a person, I was so worried. But finally, we are where we are. Now, moving forward, we must have developed some guts and some resilience and some better understanding of the COVID now, both worldwide and within the ministry, and even within the education sector. And therefore, we shall be advised by the Ministry of Health as to what will be going on and the decision to take. But from the education perspective, I think if we are able to sustain them in school, then they should be in school. But if we find it so bad that everyone must go home, we shall have no alternative but actually to ask the ministry to close schools.
But do you think the government, through the Ministry of Education, Honorable Milemba, is prepared for the fourth wave? Because even as we speak, there are no funds within the budget for the COVID-19.
I must be very exact on this, that we have to be cautious during that particular time. If the peak will be too high and cannot be managed, we shall have no any other alternative but to close. Because we have seen the president also closing down the country. Recently closed some of the counties that were highly affected. And that will become one of the normalities that we shall live with. In terms of preparedness, I don't think the government has done anything to prepare for all those things we spoke about, whether they are masks, whether it's social distancing, whether it's the thermogans and anything else. I want to tell you that no schools have received such facilities from government, whether it's the washing water points and so on and so forth. So there's no preparation. The only thing that I know they have done is to bring what was the vaccine for the teachers, but actually the vaccine again has been exhausted.
All right.
So what should be done? From the trends we have seen, the children are not thoroughly affected. In fact, if you look at the statistics in terms of the children from school who are dying of COVID, is minimal. But if you look at the teachers who are dying of COVID, it's very high.
In fact, I was about to ask you that, Milemba, because as of last year, when the country reported the first case of COVID-19, about 20 head teachers had died due to COVID, and several cases reported of learners having contracted the virus. You represent teachers through COPET. In terms of the cases during the first wave of COVID-19 and the second wave, before schools were closed and 5 countries were on partial lockdown, what were the numbers like for teachers and children who've contracted COVID and probably some sadly died due to the virus?
In terms of those who have contracted COVID, I may not give you the numbers, but in terms of those who passed on courtesy of COVID, we could rely on the statistics that we saw from the CEO Teacher Service Commission, Nancy Macharia, who said that about 63 heads had passed on courtesy of COVID, and another extreme high number of about 83 teachers had also passed on courtesy of COVID. And she was able to break down those numbers for both secondary and primary. And therefore, that's a very high number, and that's where we are. So what should be done? What should be done is that we must, and we should, and immediately, we must categorize teachers as frontline workers. And indeed they are, because the children are having some resistance to the COVID, but the teachers are passing on. So let's totally vaccinate all the teachers, not only those who are 58 years and above, but even those who are between 40 to 50 years, so that we safeguard the teachers.
Right.
And also another thing is that we must then employ more teachers. In the budget, now that you talked about the education and me being a member of the Education Committee, yes I am, we are telling the Minister of Education, the government and the Budget Committee and Parliament to pass the budget. And I'm pleading with Parliament that this time round, let's give more slots for TAC to employ more teachers, so that we can even break the classes into smaller units. This will help the teachers who are actually dying of COVID.
All right. And
it is courtesy of the congested classes that the teachers are actually contracting the COVID. And this can be helped by slotting in a higher number of teachers to be employed, so that we break up the classes, knowing and understanding that there are extra classes in schools, the candidates are not in schools still.
All right, and you are echoing, the voice of a parent that my colleague Ezron Kimari interviewed, and I'm sure you heard her say, the last parent who spoke, that even in a class, instead of having, pupils, 2 of them share a desk, you can see the children are reporting to them that they're sitting about 3 to 4 children, sharing a desk. But then when you look at the measures that the government has put in place in schools, in the far-flanked areas, leave alone the urban centers, some schools can afford to have extra desks. The measures the government has put in place, do you think it's enough to protect the teacher and the learner? And in terms of even that interaction, closeness?
I had told you earlier, and I may have to say again, that the government has not put any serious measures in schools to actually safeguard the children and the teachers. And this is the checklist. Do we have desks in schools? We don't have. The desk project was a failure, and as we talk now, we saw through the budget of education that even those who supplied the few desks, those desks have not been paid. And also note that some of the desks were taken to secondary schools when the priority should have been the primary schools, not the secondary schools. Most of the secondary schools have desks, but the schools that don't have desks are the primary schools. The other checklist are masks. How many times do we, and we are still saying that the government supplies masks? The government has supplied no masks.
In fact, I was about to ask you, Milemba, about that, because there is a concern by parents in terms of sharing the costs of the masks, the sanitizers. Yeah. Because there's some schools that are asking parents, you need to bring in your masks, you need to provide your children with masks and extra masks, and you need to give your children sanitizers. And this is something that some parents were thinking, as much as the government is saying we need to share the cost, the government should fully bear the burden, because parents are definitely feeling the effect, the financial effect of the pandemic.
During times of pandemic, I'm a teacher of history and government. And I've studied and read about pandemics. During times of pandemic, governments, and I'm urging our government, do focus all its attention to the pandemic. And they do stop other projects that are not extremely necessary to be done that particular time. So too much of the construction works we are looking and seeing around and other things that are extras must actually be forgone for the pandemic. And therefore the government must put in place all the facilities, what you have mentioned, whether they are the masks, the thermoguns, the water supply and water points and everything else. Because you fight the pandemic, it will not be there forever, after which you go back to normalcy.
All right.
And therefore the government must budget for the pandemic within our schools.
All right. And the last question.
As we talk now, they have done nothing and schools are not ready to fight the peak that is coming in July.
And the last question on this COVID-19 in schools before we cross over to the next subject about the 4-month election exercise and the government suspending that. We are seeing, parents are still being given that burden by schools, because a parent can say, I can make a mask for my child, a reusable mask, but then there are schools that are saying, you know what, we will provide those masks, but at the cost of the parent. And also, as you respond to that, your take on that, talk to us about also the vaccination exercise of teachers. How successful has it been, for teachers throughout the country?
I don't know if you meant that there's a form of exploitation by the schools.
Exactly. Exploitation of parents.
Or leaders within schools exploiting the parents courtesy of the masks. My take would have been that the government must take fully the burden of buying all the masks for its children. It's not expensive. I did the calculation for them, and it was not as high as you may have to imagine. And if there's any form of exploitation by our own teachers and our own leaders within the schools, then that is something that we can rein in. Because masks are reusable things which then they must be very cheap for parents to be able to actually buy them on a daily basis. And if there's any iota of such a misuse, then we shall be actually be finding out to also talk to the authorities. But as far as I'm concerned, stop this debate of exploitation. Let the government provide masks for children in the schools, together with sanitizers. That will solve the issue we want to go in of exploitation and so on and so forth. Now, on the second issue, I think you asked about
vaccination of teachers. In a minute, then we take a break.
Yes, we did our advocacy, and the teachers are willing to pick on the vaccines, but the vaccines are not available. So from where I see it, from the CUPET point of view, let the vaccines go to schools. And like I said earlier, let the vaccines not be limited to only teachers 58 and above, but teachers 40 and above.
All right. Mixed reactions right there, from parents, and also we are getting it from Omboko Milembe, the national chairperson of CUPET, who's also a Muhaya member of parliament and also a member of the National Assembly Education Committee. Time for a short commercial break. When we come back, we wrap up this interview with Honorable Milembe. When it comes to that decision by the government through the Ministry of Education to suspend that place